All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, at South Pasadena Lodge number 290. We are very happy to have you here tonight. To begin with, if I could everyone please silence your cell phones, make them on sound or turn them off so we can have a good lecture without interruption. I'd greatly appreciate it. Also, I'd like to quickly introduce our education committee that puts these lectures together. This is actually our 10-year anniversary of doing this lecture series, which has been very successful. And I'd just like to introduce everyone. If everybody from our education committee could please rise. We've got Worshipful Marco Garcia, who's actually the master of our lodge this year, on our education committee. Worshipful Dago Rodriguez, a past master of this lodge. Brother Jeriel Smith, who is on our education committee and past master of our Southern California Research Lodge. And Brother Nathan Bexton is over here as part of our education committee, and Brother Max, I believe, is over at the door grading people stuff. So these are all the gentlemen that help make this happen every month, which happens every month on the first Monday. If you come join us, we'd love to have you. So tonight we'll be having an interesting lecture by Right Worshipful Arthur L. Salazar Jr., who is a Grand Lodge officer. So Brother Arthur Lubay Salazar Jr. is a past master of Irvine Valley Lodge number 671 in Lake Forest, as well as the 33 Lodge in Orange County. He received the degrees of Masonry in San Francisco Lodge number 120 in 2004, and was honored with the Hiram Award in 2012 by Irvine Valley Lodge number 671. An Orange County native, Brother Salazar is a certified public accountant, having practiced tax and accountancy for over 20 years. 2020, he retired from public accounting and accepted the role of Executive Vice President and Secretary of the California Scottish Rite Foundation. He received a Bachelor of Science degree from UC Riverside and a Master of Business Taxation from USC. Brother Salazar has acted in service and leadership to the Grand Lodge of California for 18 years. He served on several Grand Lodge committees, was an inspector for 5 years, and was elected Grand Treasurer in 2015, and served 6 terms in that role, where he served as treasurer for all of our Grand Lodge entity boards. In addition, Brother Salazar is a 33rd degree Inspector General Honorary in the San Francisco Scottish Rite Valley and Orange County Scottish Rite Valley, and is a member of many of the Masonic organizations. He's been an adult volunteer for the International Order of Rainbow for Girls and Dimole International. Brother Salazar is a proud husband and father. His wife of 23 years, Dr. Laura Camacho Salazar, is a physician, and they have 3 children, all studying to join the medical profession. The Salazars reside in Aliso Viejo in Orange County. It is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Brother Salazar, Right Worshipful Salazar, to South Pasadena Lodge. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Briefly, I'd like to just present with our Worshipful Masters our pin for the year for Southern Pasadena Masonic Lodge. Present with our pin.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. All right. I just have a few notes because it's a pretty complicated topic, right? Particularly the pronunciations. So, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. So first of all, why would I be giving a talk on Quetzalcoatl? And how does it relate to Masonry? Well, for me, Quetzalcoatl actually signifies a personal journey as well. So what I'm going to be doing in the context of this presentation is taking you along on that journey so that you can see Quetzalcoatl through my eyes and what that means to me in Masonry. For those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to attend a Masters and Wardens retreat, or for those of you who won't, that's fine too. You may have seen, you won't see until October of 24, my logo. But those of you who've attended Masters and Wardens retreats will have seen my logo already. And within that logo is the head of Quetzalcoatl. My theme is inspire. The logo has over the I, the letter, the I in the middle, a square and compass. In the middle of that square and compass, instead of a sun, is Quetzalcoatl. And there's a reason for that, and that's the journey that we're going to take together. So this actually starts for me with my upbringing. It's a very Catholic upbringing, right? My very Catholic. I mean, it's like you think about religious, spiritual upbringings, and we use that term very Catholic or very, whatever the religion is, usually denoting that you had strict parents or grandparents that made sure you went to Sunday school and every event with church. Well, that's what I had in Orange County. My grandparents made sure that we went to church every Sunday. It was all about, the sacraments. It was all about a life of piety, spirituality. It was also about family, our heritage, our culture. I'm fourth generation born in California. And every generation removed from our country of origin, you start getting disconnected a little bit, right? At least that's the perception, right? People start viewing the things that you do just a little bit differently, right? The customs start to change. My wife, she's from Mexico. So she was born in Mexico City. Her family's from Oaxaca. And so those differences for me were definitely more prominent as we got married and started our family. Because there's certain traditions that she wanted to hold on to. And of course it made sense to me too. But the way we practiced it in my family was a little bit different than the way she practiced it in hers. Right? But certain things don't get watered down, right? Things like symbols. And growing up in California, in Southern California, in Orange County, in the areas where my family was from and so forth, there's certain images you grow up with that become pretty constant. Things like the Aztec calendar, images of Quetzalcoatl, the warrior carrying the princess, usually on the back of somebody's lowrider, right? But these are images we see over and over again, They become common, right? And you start to take them for granted, especially as you're a little bit more removed from the origin of their meaning. So, with that in mind, by the time I got into college and started experiencing things outside the bubble of the neighborhood that I grew up in, that's when the curiosity started. And that curiosity led me to want to learn more about my culture, learn more about the symbols that I grew up with. What do they mean? What do they truly represent? Now for me, like I said, my faith, my spirituality was very important. I grew up doing the CPD classes. And the church that I went to, it was taught by nuns, which meant that we were taught that you have all the sacraments that you're going to take, but at a certain point, there's a fork in the road. You're either going to take the sacrament of marriage or you're going to take the sacrament and become a priest. I was actually one of the young boys that considered seriously the sacrament, the priesthood. And chose that wasn't my path, realized that wasn't my path. Later in life, though, that crossroad came back to me. in a different way. When my dad passed, he was 50 when he passed, and I was 30. And that was another point in my life where my spirituality played a significant role. And having spent so much time in public accounting, while my wife was, in medicine, made me question what I was doing for humanity. And made me consider actually going to seminary and becoming a deacon in the Catholic Church again. And so again, that strength, that pull to my spirituality. But looking at that through that particular lens now, at how strong my spirituality and faith was, when that curiosity for me in college brought me to begin learning about the symbols that I had grown up seeing. And of course, one of the most prominent ones being the image of Quetzalcoatl. I began to look at religion and faith very differently. It wasn't black and white for me. It wasn't about one church over another. It really started becoming for me about all faiths. Looking at it from the perspective of just people doing good for each other. And then that's when I kind of started learning a little bit about the stories of Quetzalcoatl. Who was Quetzalcoatl? Well, this is a little bit complicated as it turns out. We all have like this thing or this image that we believe represents who Quetzalcoatl is. But it gets complicated. And it gets complicated because we're talking about faith. We're talking about different societies over large periods of time. And the symbols begin to change and shift. Right? So let's look a little bit at what Quetzalcoatl means. Right? Quite simply, the literal translation breaks Quetzalcoatl down to feathered serpent in the Nahuatl language. Right? And that's within the Aztec civilization's culture, right? Which is roughly the 1300s to the 1500s. So it almost feels not too long ago, right? Because it really isn't, and when we think about the broad spectrum of history. But that's not the only place in history where it's shown up, that image of the feathered serpent, right? We see it in the Mayan culture as Kukulkan, right? Which is the 200s roughly to the 1600s. So some overlap with the Aztec society. We also see it in the Olmecs, which goes back even further. And there we're looking at roughly the 1600 BCE to essentially about the 300s BCE. All right, so we've got a little bit of a gap there. In the Olmec society, though, quite honestly, I know somebody's spouse is I believe, a professor in this topic. I'm glad she's not here, because I probably would end up with an F by the end of the night. But I honestly could not find the translation of what it would have been in Olmec, because the references were all in relation to Aztec and Mayan. So whatever that might have been, I think is somewhat lost to time and so forth. Although she might actually know the answer, right? But then we also see it again, not just in these societies that span all this era, but we also see it in the Incans, right? We've got Viracocha, a feathered serpent. But it's not exactly a serpent in that society. And this goes back to some of the ways that Quetzalcoatl is actually perceived. So Quetzalcoatl is described as a shapeshifter. So what form can they take? Right? The feathered serpent. They can take and pretty much any form they want, including human form. Right? Then we start looking at the stories talking about who Quetzalcoatl was. Right? Because you start looking into it. And for me, it was seeing that there's stories that say Quetzalcoatl was a person. Quetzalcoatl was a god. Well, and then there's stories about, well, what kind of god was Quetzalcoatl? There's some pretty interesting stories, right? They relate to creation. They relate to war. They relate to the creation of man. Right? The story of the creation of man from Quetzalcoatl essentially comes down to, and I'm not going to actually use the names because I'll probably mess them up and butcher them, but the essence of the story is that Quetzalcoatl went to the underworld, to the world of the dead, in search of green bones that he was supposed to bring back to create mankind. But yet he ran into a trickster and fell into a trap. During that process, some of the bones were taken or destroyed. Eventually he gets out of the trap, recovers the bones that weren't taken, but now the bones have been damaged. And he takes them to a goddess. He takes them to the goddess of birth and creation, right? Well, there's a lot of ways you can look at that, right? But she's a mother goddess, right? She's a goddess over what would be now considered over pregnant women and the birthing process, right? And she took those bones and then she was getting ready to help him create mankind. There was something she needed from him though. Blood. His blood. So to the vessel with the bones, he added his blood. And from that was created mankind. In this particular story of the creation of mankind, I saw some similarities in theme from my personal spiritual perspective. I saw a connection to the stories about Jesus. A sacrifice of blood for mankind. And for me, that was one more point for me, at least spiritually, to broaden my perspective and begin to understand how much larger the world is and spirituality and how deep and ancient some of these beliefs are. What I knew as Catholicism or Christianity carries a lot of traditions, symbols that are based in other cultures, other eras that predate Christianity. We look at some of those symbols and we can draw these connections. At least I felt I could. So this connection of the blood sacrifice, to me, felt very closely aligned with the symbolism of blood sacrifice that the crucifixion represented in Catholicism. We look at the societies and how they practiced their worship of these individuals, right? And we start to see patterns emerge. Patterns that, when we get down to it, aren't too different than some of the things we do today. Now, for me, looking at this particular story of creation was, like I said, it was one example of understanding who Quetzalcoatl was, or may have been. Was Quetzalcoatl an actual person? Well, I've certainly had the same questions and heard the same questions about Jesus. Was Jesus a real person? Now, in my spiritual journey, this became something that I could understand. That the belief that this society, the Aztec society, had in Quetzalcoatl, then for me became not much different than the belief I have in Jesus and Catholicism. Seeing the world from this perspective allowed me to continue to dive a little bit deeper and look at just some of the other stories that are linked to Quetzalcoatl. Now there's a story about Quetzalcoatl's birth. And there's several, or probably more than several. There's, many variations of the story. But there's a common theme in some of those stories. That theme is that his mother is a virgin. And for me, that became another point that just helped open my mind and my eyes and my heart to what's out there. What are the beliefs that are out there? What are the perspectives that are out there? And how much different are we today than we were then? So at this point, and this is all during my formative college years, right? That I began to look at the world differently through faith. And for me, Quetzalcoatl symbolized that very strongly. Being able to look at the origin stories that came up from these ancient what we consider ancient civilizations today, right? But I think that's a little bit of a disservice to some of these civilizations. Because these civilizations are very advanced in many ways, right? We look at some of the structures. We look at the science that they had available. How can they know the position of all the stars and the planets? How can they make these calculations to create structures so finely produced, but yet so accurate in their ability to predict certain events that were happening, such as eclipses and the changing of the seasons? There's knowledge, deep knowledge that was possessed, some of which we've never recovered, right? And so when I start thinking about those connections to history, to different societies that all occupied area that would be, considered today Mexico, and broader, more area than just what's today Mexico. But for me, from a personal journey, that's how I was looking at it, right? That we've had the influence of all of these societies that were so advanced, that possess so much knowledge that we don't fully understand today. But all of that represented part of who I am, who I felt I am. A connection to something greater. A connection to everybody in my family who came before me. A responsibility to everybody in my family who came before me to continue to work to move my family forward, to honor the sacrifices that they had made. All of that came through for me through the symbolism that I grew up around, seeing things like the symbol of Quetzalcoatl. Diving into that, what we often refer to as mythology, right? But is it really fair to call it mythology? Do we call the stories of Moses or Jesus or any of the other major religions mythology? We probably could from a technical standpoint, but we don't. Why? Because it represents somebody's faith. And we try to honor that. So when I looked at it during those years and then moving forward, for me, it was trying to see it through those lenses. That this is not just some stories that were being told. These were not just something that simply got made up and, passed on. These were things that people lived and believed. Just because it's so many years ago doesn't make it any less valid or important than that which we believe today. And that's, for me, something that was important in understanding and experiencing my spirituality. That there was nothing wrong in that. There was nothing wrong in feeling that. There was nothing wrong in feeling a greater sense of connection to others. No matter what name we give that, right? So, where does it go from there? Well, for me personally, Quetzalcoatl became a little bit of a, I held on to that like it was important and simple to me because it did represent for me kind of a spiritual awakening, looking at things in such a different way. I also had the opportunity to, I missed an opportunity in high school to take my confirmation in high school. But I actually did that later in life. So before I got married as an adult, I took the confirmation classes through the Catholic Church. I was fortunate to have an instructor who was a deacon at our church, who was also very passionate about history. And so every Sunday after Mass, we would meet. And one of the questions he would always ask about the reading for that Sunday was, do you understand the context? Do you understand the historical context? Because it can change how you perceive things. It can change the lessons that you take away from those stories, from those messages, right? Is it literal? No. Is the story literal? Not always. Sometimes it is. I don't know. We weren't there, right? We don't know what really happened. But if the stories about Jesus could be true, the same could be said about figures like Quetzalcoatl, his ability to transform into man, his ability to walk amongst man, his ability to transform into nature. These things that we feel. In Catholicism, I looked at that as almost like the Holy Spirit, right? You know, connecting to nature, that feeling of oneness, to me represented part of the Holy Trinity, right? The Holy Spirit, that connection to everything. That warm feeling that I get when I feel connected to nature and to other people. For me, that couldn't have been possible without exploring the stories of Quetzalcoatl when I was in college. But understanding context, like the deacon at my parish was constantly asking me, became important. Right? Because then we start looking looking at the stories of Quetzalcoatl. Right? Was he a man? Well, the stories allude to the fact that he started as a man. He became a god. Depends on which stories you're following, right? But then there's a story about his return. That Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return in the 5th era. Right? That would be the beginning of the 5th era. And I started thinking about it. Where else have I heard this thing before? That this man who was a god was supposed to return as a man. Well, in church. So again, I start looking at it from this perspective now of context, right? And the context tells me that I need to look deeper, I need to look broader. And by this point in my life, at this point I was getting ready to get married. But my wife and I, we met in undergrad. We met when we were 17. And quite honestly, by the time we were 18, we started dating. I knew she was the one, right? I just knew. And then the conversations with her, and then hearing her perspective, having grown up somewhere else that was different from me, and having had a very different experience, and then talking to her family, who parts of her family actually still spoke Nahuatl, right? And starting to recognize that, wow, maybe these things I was learning about Quetzalcoatl aren't so ancient and lost after all. There's not that many people that speak Nahuatl anymore, but it still exists. There's still villages and towns that speak it. It's now being taught in universities. I know my oldest daughter was thinking about taking it at UCLA. She decided it was going to probably be too hard of a class to get an A in. But realizing that it's available, right, that it existed, told me that maybe this isn't so ancient after all. Maybe these things aren't so distant. And it helped open my perspective, right? So looking at the context, you start to see these stories take shape. Right? Because according to the most common stories now, who did the Aztecs believe was the next appearance in human form of Quetzalcoatl? Right? Well, it was the Spaniards. And you hear stories saying that this led to the Aztecs essentially opening up their society to the Spaniards, which ultimately led to, well, the Aztecs not being around anymore. But now we look at perspective and context, right? Well, who shared those stories? It wasn't the Aztecs. It was the Spaniards, right? And so we know from history that the perspective gets changed, right? It reflects those groups that are still around or that survived. You know, we say that history belongs to the conquerors, right? Not to the conquered. It's the conquerors who write history. And through that, certain things can get erased. Now, through my Masonic trials, yeah, that too, I've had the opportunity to travel to Mexico now more in these last 2 years than I ever had before in my life. You know, I had the opportunity to meet so many brothers from Mexico and have so many wonderful conversations and help further open my perspectives of what the world and Masonry is all about. But through that travel, there comes to be a curiosity, right? And the curiosity ends up being more about somebody who has grown up in California, born in California, who's fourth generation. The curiosity about how connected can I really be to culture and history from Mexico. And how I felt visiting Mexico, visiting places like Mexico City, visiting the pyramids that relate to Quetzalcoatl just outside Mexico City, right? I know some of you could probably rattle off the name of them at the tip of your tongue. And I've got it somewhere here in my notes, but if I try it, I'm probably going to butcher it. As I mentioned, my wife, her family is from Oaxaca. So we went to the town in Oaxaca where her family's from, in Nochitlan, and had the opportunity to visit with her family there, visit the cemetery there, and experience that there were tombstones there that were over 300 years old with names of her family members. And we were there with our children. And just that feeling of connection to something that goes back so far was very profound there. Because when I look at it here in California, we don't quite go back that far. I can go to a cemetery in Santa Ana and find headstones of my family that go back, that show that they were born in the 1880s. Right? But anything, when we start getting past that, older than that, in California, we don't find structures or things much older than that. We just don't. Why? Again, it's historical context, right? The conquerors tell you the history. And that's not to put a negative tone on, what happened here in California when it went from being part of Mexico to being eventually part of the US. It's simply to say that as progress took place in California and the need for new homes and new locations for expansion and businesses, structures and towns and other things like that might have had some sort of significance to history were erased. It happens, right? In Mexico City, there's a site that's been, we all know that it's been built over so many times, but there's a site that shows 3 different eras on the same site, right? It's all exposed because it's become a historic site, right? And we see those influences of Aztec and so forth in all these civilizations influence in Mexico City in that one site. So we know it happens, right? We build over and things get lost. And for me, that was part of also like this appreciation of being in Mexico and understanding the history and the stories of things like, the stories of Quetzalcoatl. Because it's something now, like from a context perspective, has been kind of built over. And it's become commercialized. We see it on souvenirs and so many other things, right? And it takes us away from its original meaning. So who was Quetzalcoatl? Was Quetzalcoatl a man? Was Quetzalcoatl a god? And what kind of god was Quetzalcoatl? What attributes are associated with Quetzalcoatl? Creation, light, wisdom, war. But is that a bad thing? Do we know any other religions that have the same attributes attached to the deity? I know Catholicism has it. Old Testament says God was vengeful. New Testament says God was love. Again, for me, very similar in hearing the same types of themes in the stories of Quetzalcoatl. This, for me, created that foundation, like I said, of a connection to Quetzalcoatl as a representation of heritage, of culture, of knowledge. Being told that we, as a Mexican who's now disconnected from Mexico, came from a society that had advanced technology, that had advanced knowledge about astronomy, construction, and so many other things. Now I fast forward to closer to today. And what do we hear in that? We have science, geometry, mathematics, astronomy. And then you start ringing a bell to our Masons. Have we heard these things before? In a lecture, perhaps? So now, for me, I see this connection even deeper, right? It's opened up, in my view, not just my spirituality, but my connection into Masonry even deeper. Do we have Quetzalcoatl in Masonry? Yeah, there's an order of Quetzalcoatl, founded in the 40s. It's part of the shrine, and it's not a secret because they have a website. On that website, they have their history. It's about 4 pages. I actually printed it. But the first couple of pages is a very short synopsis on who Quetzalcoatl was, picture of the pyramid, right? where you've got this serpent that comes down with the effects of the sun and so forth, and shadows. And then they've got the explanation of the Order of Quetzalcoatl and what it is to them today. The founder of this Masonic order was a historian who studied Mesoamerica and was very passionate about the study of Quetzalcoatl. And so he was inspired by these very things. A lot of the same things that inspired me with my spiritual journey. It inspired him enough to create a Masonic order, specifically under the name of Quetzalcoatl. Now, I'm not going to be starting any new Masonic orders, that's for sure. But I did, like I said, include something personal to me in my logo. That symbol of Quetzalcoatl. In the place where we would normally either have the sun or the letter G. The interesting part about that design was when I met with Emily Lamone, our chief marketing director at Grand Lodge, and her team. And I started sharing my ideas and concepts for my theme and my logo. I didn't have a particular image in mind for my logo. I was sharing ideas and concepts about unity, about heritage, about expression of individuality, about oneness as a Masonic fraternity. I was amazed when they came back to me with some designs. And there was a design in there that had Mayan influence in the style of the letter writing and the ribbon under the word inspire. And then it featured Quetzalcoatl inside the square compass. I knew right away that that was going to be the logo. Because somehow it came up like it was meant to be. At least that's how I viewed it. Here was Quetzalcoatl reappearing in my journey in life in a meaningful way, helping to remind me of my spirituality and my connection to everybody. And while I say that, it's also really easy for me to say that that does not take away, not one bit, about how strongly I still feel about my beliefs in Catholicism and my practice of Catholicism. It's just allowed me to look at the greater world and the greater oneness of man. So, who is Quetzalcoatl? I know who Quetzalcoatl is to me. Quetzalcoatl, for me, has been a guide through life in my spiritual journey. A guide that ultimately helped lead me to Masonry. I didn't know it when it was happening, but he was. He was guiding me. Was it Quetzalcoatl? Was it the Holy Spirit? Can they be one and the same? Now that's a question, right? There's no wrong answer though. Because it's all of these things, again with context, right? We see symbolism appear many times through history. Going back to ancient civilizations all the way up to current times, we see themes recurring. how many societies had the virgin birth, a resurrection, a blood sacrifice for the benefit of mankind. Is it possible that these things could represent ancient knowledge that we've just reinterpreted over the years? Does it make them wrong to say that? No, I don't believe so. So we have answers tonight about who Quetzalcoatl was? Probably more questions than answers from everybody, but I think it's a personal journey, right? And while there's certainly many things about who Quetzalcoatl is that we could dissect on a historical context, an archaeological context, we could certainly analyze the societies in much greater detail to understand the practices and the true meanings that they held. It's not always necessary to understand a feeling, right? Well, with that, I've now taken you on a journey of who Quetzalcoatl has been to me. And sure, it's not exactly what you thought this lecture was going to be, because I know that's not what I thought it was going to be when I was first asked to do it, but again, it was something that evolved. I ended up on a journey just coming to this presentation. And I want to thank you for joining me on that journey. And I hope you found it interesting, or hope maybe there was something that you got from that on a personal level at some point. So thank you.